Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Love, Power, and Networks, Building an Equitable Regional Food Economy and Community with Curtis Ogden. This is Tom with Forward Community Investments, and we're excited to have you on for today's presentation. This represents our fourth installment of our monthly webinar series on racial equity. Before we get going, I'd like to take this opportunity to share some background on how we got here today. Forward Community Investments has been serving the state of Wisconsin for over 20 years. FCI transforms Wisconsin communities by supporting organizations and programs that reduce racial, social, and economic disparities. Our mission is to be an investor, connector, and advisor for organizations and initiatives that reduce social, racial, and economic disparities in Wisconsin communities. Our vision is an equitable and inclusive Wisconsin that is built on cooperative social action. With the help of BMO Harris Bank, we are able to offer this series of webinars to provide partners with tools and approaches that can be used to advance racial equity within their work at no cost to you. BMO Harris Bank is an active partner in Wisconsin communities and demonstrates strong corporate citizenship as an important part of whom they are and how they approach community. Volunteerism and corporate responsibility are a key part of the culture at BMO Harris Bank. It's how they demonstrate their commitment to and investment in the communities they serve. As you may know, we did have a few technical difficulties with the recording feature on GoToWebinar during our last presentation with Curtis, and he was so gracious enough to present for us again so that we can hopefully avoid those difficulties and be able to share this with everyone. We have received a lot of positive feedback from attendees from his previous session and are excited to share this with a wider audience. Let's get to know a little bit about our speaker. Curtis Ogden is a senior associate with the Interaction Institute for Social Change, a collaborative capacity building organization based in Boston that supports social change leaders, organizations, and networks through training, process design, facilitation, and large-scale engagement consulting services. Curtis has served as lead process designer and facilitator for the FSNE Network Building Initiative and also supports other multi-stakeholder networks focused on change in the food, public health, and education sectors with an emphasis on equity, including Chesapeake Bay Foodshed Network, Interinstitutional Network for Food, Agriculture and Sustainability, Cancer-Free Economy Network, and Connecticut Right from the Start. For the past 4 years, Food Solutions New England has been building a regional network to transform the New England food system into a resilient driver of racial equity and food justice, health, sustainable farming and fishing, and thriving communities. This has entailed creating deeply trusting relationships across a variety of boundaries, inspiring a more holistic and systemic conversation about food and sustainability, and addressing fundamental issues of power, privilege, and inequity. This webinar will focus on some of the key lessons and challenges of this equitable network building effort to date. At this time, I'd like to turn the call over to Curtis, and we can get going.
Great. Well, thank you, Tom. As you give me control here over the screen, I will get my screen up and running. So I want to thank you, Tom, for that introduction, and also Forward Community Investments for dedicating a series to this very important topic and for the invitation to contribute to it. And certainly to thank everybody who has signed up for these webinars. I've had a chance to see the organizational affiliations, so I have a better sense of the work that you all are doing. And I just really want to thank you for what you're doing to create healthy, equitable, and sustainable communities in Wisconsin and beyond. And I also like to start my presentations by acknowledging my own identity and my own unearned privilege as a white, straight, able-bodied, formally educated man, and that has contributed to opportunities opening up for me, including this one. And so my hope with this presentation and all the work that I do is to find, to contribute into the heart of a more just, loving, and life-affirming world. So I want to say just a little bit more about where I'm coming from in terms of my organization. I'm here mainly to tell the story of Food Solutions New England, and I do that through the lens of the Interaction Institute for Social Change. And we are a 25-year-old capacity building organization. As Tom mentioned, we're based in Boston, but we work with partners around the country and the world around issues of justice and sustainability. And we typically show up as trainers, facilitators, coaches, and consultants to a variety of collaborative change efforts. And importantly, in all of this work that we do, we bring a particular lens to building collaborative capacity for change. This lens lifts up the importance of three different but very related facets for seeing and doing the work. And one, as you see here, is the facet of networks. That is, understanding that organizations and individuals are not the unit of change in our work, but rather these more vast networks of interconnected actors. So we bring to the table the importance of understanding, of seeing and working with these patterns of connection as being fundamentally important to making change happen, as is bringing an understanding of power dynamics to the work. At the Institute, we don't see power as a good thing or a bad thing. It is, in general, the ability to influence people and situations, and it's just always there and plays itself out in different ways in different contexts. So seeing and working with power is critical in our work. As is, as you see here, leveraging love as a force for social transformation. And I will say that sometimes when we use the word love in public, some people get a bit squeamish or feel like it's a bit lightweight and perhaps airy-fairy, but we see it as anything but. Here we're really invoking a deeper sense of the word, the fundamental regard for one another's humanity, and that it's the collective of these facets that we're really seeing contribute to movement for change. Something else I also want to just put out there for folks is, if you talk to people who know me well, they'll tell you that I'm a bit of a network nerd, which I'm proud to admit. Most of my work, in fact, is with these multi-stakeholder and multi-organizational networks. And for me, networks are not just a passing fancy, a tactic, a strategy. To me, they are the very currency of life itself, and I've been supporting these state and regional food and public health networks because I believe our survival and our humanity depend on it. And I'm certainly not alone in that belief. There are others who think similarly, including many scientists who are seeing how networks and patterns of connection are the basis of health and abundance in human communities and ecosystems and in other living systems. And it's striking that networks are really so natural to us, so much so that we may not often think about them. But the fact of the matter is that life is by definition a network. It thrives on connection. And we know this because we're alive. And when we're not feeling alive, it's often because we feel disconnected in some form or fashion. Cut off from, could be other people, from the natural world, from our feelings, from values, from resources, from power, or a deeper sense of purpose. Life really does thrive on connection at so many different levels. And this understanding is showing up in many domains and influencing how people are thinking and acting, including in the organizational realm. One of my favorite authors, Seth Godin, has been writing about this, essentially bringing a network lens to organizational development and business. And in larger systems, when we think about economies and economics, my friend Sally Gerner writing about how it is really healthy human webs that underlie long-term prosperity in the most holistic sense. So really, boiling a lot of this down, we might say that we're understanding that while our starting points may be different, our fates are very much connected. And that really is at base the call for thinking and working in networked ways. And this is not a new invitation. It's one that is ages old and one that seems to require periodic reminders. So going back just over 50 years ago, the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. wrote from that Birmingham jail cell these words: in a real sense, all life is interrelated. All people are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be, and you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This, he wrote, is the interrelated structure of reality. And we know this. We know this, but what plays out in many communities runs counter to this wisdom that we carry. And so really the question I bring to this webinar, and frankly to all the work we do, is how can we take what we know to be true to heart? How can we reconnect ourselves with life, with liveliness that yields more just and more sustainable benefits in our communities? And to bring that fairly lofty question down to earth, I'm going to share with you the story of a visionary and brave group of people who are tackling these questions as they try to create a new New England, a region that's built on new definitions of health and prosperity. And this story really begins with a man named Brian Donahue, who you see pictured here. Brian's an agricultural historian and a farmer. And a number of years ago, Brian started asking questions about the history of land use in our region and what amount of land might be put back into production to help the region grow more food. The inspiration for this thinking were his concerns about climate change, as well as increasing economic uncertainty and what these might do to national and global food supplies that would affect New England. Well, Brian's questions ended up attracting a small band of academic researchers and writers who were also spurred on by concerns about nutrition-related disease and health disparities and how these might be addressed by greater food self-sufficiency around our region. Because when you look at it closely, we're in a pretty precarious position here. We produce in New England just a fraction of our food. The vast majority of land is not in production, and the land that is in production is constantly under threat of development. Our fisheries are in decline here and elsewhere. Fishermen and fishing communities are struggling to survive. And food insecurity in the region hovers anywhere between 10 and 16%. So Brian and his writing team looked at this and believed not just that we could, but that we must produce more of our own food. And they ended up creating a report called A New England Food Vision, through which they put forward the suggestion that we could reasonably produce at least 50% of our own food, and specifically of clean, fair, just, and accessible food for all New Englanders by the year 2060. So 50 by 60. Well, in 2012, because of my work with food-related networks in Rhode Island and Vermont, I was invited to attend the second annual New England Food Summit that was convened in Burlington, Vermont by the University of New Hampshire Sustainability Institute. And it was there that Brian and the writing team were to unveil their work. And you know, I'll say that no one thought that a report alone would inspire the kind of revolution that we need here in the region. That said, I'm not sure anyone anticipated the tone of the conversation that would ensue once the vision was put on the table. While there were some good initial questions and conversations about how much land could we put aside and actually, you know, what constitutes sustainability in terms of overall percentage of food produced that's consumed here, things started to get kind of edgy, frankly, as a few people were standing and moving to the edges of the room. I noticed people were pacing and some looking agitated, and then a gentleman, a farmer from a region, raised his hand and weighed in quite forcibly, essentially suggesting that the vision was telling people what they should do, what they should grow. And a clarification was made by Tom Kelly, the convener of the summit, that that was not the intent. That was not the intent. It was really about putting out a few different scenarios. Well, then others started to sort of pile on to that initial comment. feeling like the vision was attacking and critiquing farmers. You're telling us we're doing this wrong. So it got quite heated for a while, and eventually things did cool down. We took a break, and I watched as people kind of gathered in their different factions. And really, the remarkable thing is that despite that hostility, there were people who left that room still seeing hope and possibility. What I like to say is maybe they understood the truth of this old saying that all truth passes through these three stages. First, it's ridiculed. Second, it's violently opposed. And third, it's accepted as being self-evident. Certainly, the writing team took their lumps, but they went right back to refining their work. And perhaps most importantly, a group including funders and academics and advocates stepped forward saying it was time to invest in supporting a network to encourage the region forward. Now, I will say that we all agree that we needed a network, but this idea of bringing together diverse states and communities, needs and interests, and building some kind of common sense of commitment was a bit daunting. Honestly, we were not entirely clear how that would be done, but we knew it had to be done. And it had to be done for various reasons, because clearly the scale and the complexity of this system that we need to not just change but create is so much larger than any single actor, because the problems that we face when you think about land use and health equity, nutrition, poverty, it's all fundamentally interdependent. And because there's already so much good that is happening in the region, so much knowledge, so much promising practice that's not connected, that could speed progress. And frankly, it was clear that we needed to get to know one another better. So in 2012, Food Solutions New England was born, and my organization was hired to develop this collaborative infrastructure and process for a regional food network. And one of the first things that we did was we put in place a provisional network structure that was built around some key, really core functions that would strengthen connectivity and collaboration around the region. And this structure was built out around this original convening team at the University of New Hampshire, but then also included some other teams, some looking at coordination and communications, some tending to the overall process design and facilitation, and then very importantly, a group that we called the Network Design Team that you see in green here and that you see in image here. This is a team of 25 to 30 people, depending on the year, and we've been at this for a few years, who are from around the region, representing geographic, racial, gender, age, and sectoral diversity, who bring their own connections, other related networks. And their role is to help extend reach, weave connections, create greater buy-in and engagement, and really undertake the work of this broader network development in the region. And once this team was put in place, really our job was to build trust from the core out, to work with that team, to build and deepen trust. And I'm sure as folks know the importance of trust, really in any social endeavor, but in networks in particular, it just can't be overstated. Trust is really what makes a network work. The deeper the trust that you have, the greater the likelihood of realizing these greater network effects, things like accelerating learning, more generous sharing, more timely responsiveness, growing the overall pie of resources, not just further dividing it, and creating spontaneous collaborations. So the network team, we met every other month to start for an entire day or more. Our meetings were built around meals, time to break bread and be in informal conversation with one another. And a fundamental activity that we engaged in was storytelling, making time for people to talk from their full selves, not just their professional titles and positions, to share regular updates about their food system related work, certainly, and also to create spaces for people to talk honestly about some of their challenges. We also took time for field visits to tour places of meaning and relevance to our collective work. For example, we went to Gloucester, the fishing community. We spent time at a dairy farm, at a food bank, with food services at a university and at a community kitchen. And through that work, but also through some more facilitated intentional work, we built alignment, specifically building alignment around shared language, creating a glossary of common terms that are relevant to food systems. And we also built alignment and shared understanding about what the regional vision was meant to be, really specifically a catalyst, not a prescription. Sort of a North Star and conversation starter, not telling people what to do. And also building alignment around the purpose of the network, really carefully situating it within a broader universe of other efforts in the region and helping to connect and add value to those. But ultimately, the result of all that trust building work and alignment work, which took a good 9 months, was evident just at the following summit in Maine, where people came together with a marked spirit of enthusiasm and appreciation for what really working as a region would do, opening up opportunities to new markets and new partnerships and new learning. And people embraced the vision, actually with a standing ovation, which was incredible. And so leaving Maine, there was a lot of goodwill already cultivated, which would set us up for some deeper work to come in the year that followed. But I want to pause there, Tom, and see what questions that might be out there.
Sure, sure. Well, thank you so much for that, the first portion. A lot of good information. One thing I really like to point out too is I liked how you brought storytelling in. That's a very powerful tool that sometimes gets overlooked, and just the kind of check-in about, how are things going. I think sometimes that gets overlooked with the amount of, things that need to get done, but I think that's a very important aspect too. And so I've been getting a few questions here and there. Some of them may be a little bit scattered as far as some of the information that that you are providing. But so one of those questions was, do you think that these issues can be addressed in our current economic model? And then do you have any resources or more information on how one can obtain some of the economic resources of these food security issues?
Sure. So I'll respond to the economic questions. I just wanted to go back to what you were saying about storytelling just quickly.
Sure.
That one important point that was made to us, just given that we had this diverse network team, is that not to tell stories, it was pointed out, privileges certain cultural perspectives. There are certain cultures and communities where storytelling is the way that information is shared. And so actually use of storytelling was a way of creating equity within the room in terms of different modalities to talk and share information. So I just thought that was important to point out. I think the question about economics is great, and I would love to do a whole another webinar on that. I mean, it connects to this idea that as we're growing these networks, I often say that networks are not just a so that, but they are an end in of themselves. That is, we are creating the networked infrastructure that ultimately we see as being the foundation of the new economy. There is great work going on with a group that I'm a part of called the Research Alliance on Regenerative Economics that is looking at how network sciences can inform our understanding of new economic structures. There's evidence of that happening at the local level for sure, in things like co-ops and some regional co-ops of co-ops where network infrastructure is, if you apply a network lens, they are using network principles to fuel growth and recapturing resources and recycling resources. So I think there's great promise there that I'm eager to continue to mine. And the question about, given the current economic models, we're definitely up against it. One of the things we've realized with Food Solutions New England is that this is not just about changing the current system. In some ways, this is about creating the alternative system, which other people could jump to. Buckminster Fuller, the philosopher and inventor, once said, you don't try and you don't try and change the existing system. There's just too much that can be broken, that will resist change. You create the alternative, and then have people join you over there. I think that's more the spirit that we're working with.
Great. So I have, like I said, I've been getting some questions coming in, but I think that they will fit better maybe after this next section that you go over, Curtis. So I think I'm just
Great.
going to hold on to those questions, and then we can address those after the next section of your presentation.
Super. Thanks, Tom.
Yep.
So I'll pick up the story where I left off, which was in that summit in Maine, going back about 3 years now. And near the end of that summit, one of the network team members, Karen Spiller, who you actually see pictured here, who's from Boston and is on our network team and core team, came to me and said, we have to talk. And what we talked about was that in one of the summit breakout sessions that year that she'd been a part of, a small, diverse, multiracial group had really strongly been voicing their concern that race and racism needed to be much more central to conversations at the summit, and that not formally making space for this actually would run counter to the long-term viability of the vision. So long story short, we decided it was time to make racial equity a formal, fuller conversation and commitment for the network. Now, again, we made the commitment, and people at the time would have asked, so what does that mean? And we really weren't sure. We just agreed it was the right time, building on that foundation of trust. And in the best spirit of network leadership, we decided we'd figure it out together. So to provide a little context on that front in particular, New England, like the rest of our country, is plagued by racial disparities across virtually every food system-related indicator you could imagine. Depending upon where you live in our region, north, south, east, west, the state population is anywhere between 70 and 94% white, so majority white, but people of color are disproportionately represented when you look at rates of food insecurity, obesity, diabetes, and of course all of that is directly correlated and connected to disparities in rates of unemployment, of poverty, of wealth gaps, of differences in rates of home and land ownership, and then certainly access to capital. So to quote one person in that ad hoc meeting at the summit, she said, we can't talk about a region being whole and healthy while ignoring that reality. It's not possible. And so we started looking long and hard at the data, disaggregating the data, and listening to stories of discrimination in our region. So again, storytelling playing an important role. For example, this is Vera Francis, who's a member of the network design team. She has been on the front lines of the Passamaquoddy tribe's work to protect their right to fish in northern Maine, and really to protect their food sovereignty in general. Their sovereignty, I should say, in general. Well, over the past few years, the glass eel fishery has become valuable to non-tribal people, and I should say that the glass eel is sacred to the Passamaquoddy culture. So the Passamaquoddy are now seeing this major encroachment on their fishing grounds. Well, they've stepped up, the tribe has stepped up their efforts to protect the glass eels, and the government, the Maine's governor in particular, has retaliated, doing things like rescinding a 4-year-old executive order that said the tribes would be consulted on state decisions that affect Native people. Not too long ago, there was an order to confiscate the tribe's fishing gear. I mean, this is real. These are the stories we're hearing. We've gotten to hear from Marilyn Moore, who's a member of our network team, and since she joined the network team, has become a state senator in Connecticut representing Bridgeport, one of the poorest and most segregated communities in the state. And part of what drew Marilyn to FS&E was the connection between food and public health. Prior to becoming senator, she ran something called the Witness Project. She actually started that initiative, which is an effort to reduce rates of breast cancer among African American women. And the reason she created the project was that she had been hearing about and experiencing directly biased treatment of women in her community by health practitioners that caused many African American women to avoid hospitals, to avoid mammograms, or pursuing more nutrition-based approaches to cancer prevention and care, all of which has been leading to later stage detection and therefore higher mortality rates. And I was actually with Marilyn in Hartford, Connecticut, a couple of months ago, meeting with some of our younger sort of emerging leaders in the region for a retreat. And she just reeled off story by story with remarkable good humor of what she's up against as one of the few African American women senators in New England. And this is partisan politics aside, many situations where she walks into rooms and people will not believe that she is the senator, just not believing that is true. So she likes to say to me, she spends more time than anyone else in the Senate saying, "But I'm the senator." In addition to sharing these stories of discrimination, we've also been talking open and honestly about privilege. And at a very memorable gathering, also in Hartford, one of the white members of the network team shared very openly about his unearned privilege and inherited wealth that's allowed him to go to college without debt, purchase land to farm, and work part-time while supporting his family. I mean, really breaking it down to dollars and cents. And I remember distinctly at a break after his story, two people of color grabbing me and saying, "I've never, ever heard a white person say that before, open and honest in public." So while many of us, on the network team who are experiencing directly or hearing about, these dynamics are compelled to rally the region, as I'm sure folks know, it's not that easy, especially in this political climate. Like this image here in the cartoon, there are voices that are just countering whatever people say. I don't understand what race has to do with food, or I live in Vermont or New Hampshire or Maine. Everyone's white up here. We can't really relate. Or one of the classic responses is, look, it's not really about race in this region, it's about class. And I imagine that some of these voices will sound familiar. And the question is, how do you respond? How do you get people to see beyond their own localized and limited views? How do you get them to see that race fundamentally matters in this work? Well, the network team has become the testing ground for those questions and answers to those questions as we engage in our own learning and addressing our own blind spots and biases. We've spent the better part of the last couple of years normalizing conversations about race and racism in the food system, noting that while other equities certainly exist and must be addressed, this is the most egregious and perhaps difficult to tackle. So we have been, again, meeting for full days every other month and continuing to share data and stories to help us understand what's been happening in our region. We have been learning together about the differences between equality and equity, which is really the difference between everyone getting the same versus acknowledging that there are different starting points given privilege and discrimination, and we need to be aiming for that everyone gets what they need to succeed. We've been talking about how racism operates at different levels, emphasizing the need to see structural racism, not just interpersonal racism, and that structural racism happening over time and across different institutions is a fundamental contributor to the state of our food system. So just to clarify a little bit more about that, structural racism is bias across institutions and society. It's the cumulative and compounded effects of an array of factors that systemically privilege some people and others based on race, gender, or other dimensions of identity. So you might think about the racial wealth gap, as being an example of that. So, we've been diving deeply into all of this and sharing this and really taking this work out into broader circles in our community. So we've also been talking about how you can address these different levels of racism and oppression, from the internalized, the impersonal, interpersonal, the institutional, and the structural. One other conventional, or I should say innovation that we've created as a region is something called the 21-Day Equity Habit Building Challenge, using the virtual environment and social media to invite people from around the region to commit to spending 1 day talking about, learning about, taking action around racial inequity. We did that last year, and nearly 200 people signed on, well beyond the region of New England, and we'll be doing it again this year between April 10th and April 30th. And one of the greatest outcomes of this was hearing how the exercise had been picked up by others, by colleges and high schools in the region who did their own challenges. And I'll just mention that another important network innovation was the creation of this ambassadors initiative, through which 3 members of our network team, Marilyn Moore, Karen Spiller, and Julius Kalawale, were funded to do strategic outreach to diverse groups and communities around our region. And I think it's important to say that this has not been fundamentally about recruitment so much as listening and conversation to develop shared understanding of aspirations and needs, of areas of mutual interest, and seeing where those conversations would lead. I will say that through those conversations, important connections have been made with groups such as the NAACP of Rhode Island, the Black and Latino Caucus of Connecticut, and Migrant Justice, which works for farm worker rights in Vermont. And we've also been looking at and trying out tools to integrate equity more formally into organizational decision-making, including developing a racial equity impact assessment, which looks at how decisions may impact different groups. And really the point of the assessment is to strive to build power around decisions, not simply through inclusion, but this notion of collaborative solidarity, that we are really working together and acknowledging that we each have our respective interests and looking for win-win solutions, not just inviting people to our party and asking them to conform. So again, the result of all of this work over the last couple of years has been very encouraging. We're seeing people drawn to the network because of this commitment to racial justice. We're seeing individual organizations take up internal work around power and privilege. We're seeing food-related networks in the region make similar kinds of commitments. And we've seen the network itself diversify, moving from roughly about 15% of people of color in attendance at the Food Summit in 2014 to almost double that in 2015. And really, the point is these numbers are significant because they fundamentally change the conversation that we can have in the room. And that was something positively noted by nearly everyone who attended our last summit. It helped people have a fuller picture of the region, have sort of fresher, newer, fuller perspectives, and help them understand the work that must be done and the opportunity in front of us. So once again, Tom, I think I will pause there and see what questions there are out there.
Great, great. So I've been getting some in. I think that, and some of the ones that came in previously that I feel maybe fit a little bit better at this break as opposed to the first break. But so one of those questions came from an organization that is focused on sustainable agriculture, and they had mentioned that conversations about racial equity have been left out of the conversation. And just curious to get maybe one, 2, 3 things that you would recommend that would be that would help them in starting these conversations within their organization as well as the broader community.
Yeah, that's a great question. My mind goes in a lot of different directions, and part of me wants to channel Dr. Kamara Jones at the CDC, who's written about something she calls the gardener's tale, in thinking about the different ways in which racism operates in any system. But in an interview that was done of her, she talks, if she had her wish, what would she wish for? And she's talked about the need for everybody to, first of all, fundamentally understand what racism is. And I think that is really a first step, is just to really fully educate oneself about what racism is, how it's operated over time, understanding that it's not just interpersonal, it's internalized, it's institutional, it's structural, and then to acknowledge it exists, it's still with us, and then to look for evidence of it. again, you only need to disaggregate data at any scale in this country to see that, while you may have a white majority population in a given setting, the disparities when you break it down by race will egregiously generally show that people of color are overrepresented, with those negative indicators. I think to reach out to those communities with curiosity. If you are all white, with humility, go to those communities and not simply seeing those communities as being deficit-ridden, but certainly, we talk about going to those who are on the margins in various ways in communities to understand that there's tremendous resilience and strength and plenty to be learned from how those communities and individuals navigate day to day. There are great resources online in many different places. You can go to Race Forward as an organization, the Center for Social Inclusion, at the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society, Policy Link, all are great organizations to learn more about this. And certainly join us for our upcoming 21-day Racial Equity Challenge. You'll learn a lot about yourself and the issues as a result.
Thanks for those resources, Curtis. We'll also be including those resources that he had mentioned in an email that will go out to the registrants for this presentation, as well as on our webpage and things like that. So all of the resources that Curtis did mention will be available on our website, so you can dig for them there. So moving on, I got one more question before we kind of head back into the presentation a little bit. And so one comment and kind of led to a question is that they're understanding there's more of importance of building relationships, networks, and collaboration, and all of that really takes time. Do you have any suggestions for how to obtain funding for building these networks and fundings and relationships versus funding for actions and projects? Any information would be great if you could hand that off.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I mean, I should be more forthcoming. Certainly that in New England we're blessed with a few regional funders who really get the importance of building relationships and networks and who've committed to this for the long term, and understanding that may not be the same in every setting. I do think that there's a lot of funder education that needs to be done. I think that there are an increasing number of funders who are interested in this conversation. There's good work happening both within Grantmakers for Effective Organizations and the leadership learning community to pull funders together to talk about networks. So you might want to go to those communities and see where the conversation is. It's a real tension, right? That people will come to the table with different interests in terms of what they want to see and what they consider impact. And for some people, relationships are fine and good, but they're just kind of too squishy. They're not sure what that adds up to, or having a good conversation might be, nice, but again, what does that equate to in terms of impact? And I think, yeah, this is where I think coming back to understanding that relationships are not just relationships. When we're strategic about building relationships and trust and thinking about then what we feed through those relationships and patterns of connection, that we are creating the new structures that really do add up to social change. And that conversations are not just conversations. When there's learning happening, when there is moral support being offered, that is creating resilience in communities. And again, coming back to my friend and colleague, Sally Gerner, who's written a lot about networks and sustainability and justice and democracy, she really talks about how fundamentally our long-term prospects on this planet are going to be rooted in our ability to learn more quickly and have that learning be rooted in what's actually happening. And so having a diversity of connections, a diversity of perspectives that are connected, where information is flowing in timely and robust ways is really key to resilience. So to me, I'd like to see these conversations about relationships and just conversation put in a different light, because I think they are much more important than some give them credit for being.
Great. So as we'll keep going on, I think like I said, I have a couple more questions, but I think those are more overarching questions that we can share towards the end of the presentation. I know that you have a few more slides left, so I think we'll go ahead with those slides, and then we can come back to some of these questions.
Great. Well, I'll just end with just a couple minutes here just to touch on where FSNE is heading, and then just maybe some last lessons learned. We've been engaged over the past 9 months in a system mapping process that has yielded this graphic that you see on the screen. It was an effort that we engaged in another firm with to think about our regional food system, and given all of the various dynamics within the system, what are some key core focal points if we are really interested in getting to this 50 by 60 goal that's also qualified in terms of it being rooted in these values of sustainability, equity, vibrant local economy and regional economy. And what that's shown, you'll see here, in terms of these green boxes, is that what we need to do as a network and as a region is engage and mobilize more people, really building more democratic engagement, that we need to identify, engage, and support formal and informal leadership at all levels to move forward on this vision, that we need to link knowledge, need to do much more work around sharing promising practices and what's going on in different parts of the region, what people are learning, challenges and successes, and also really fundamentally making a business case that counters this idea that you can't really make a profit from being a regional business, or only a few could. That if we are able to sort of lift the hood and look at the current assumptions around the existing business case and change some of those assumptions and structures, that we can create a new business case that would support this vision as being viable. So we're right in the midst of that, figuring out structures around those various conversations that would yield strategies. And to bring this back to my organization, the Interaction Institute for Social Change, it's interesting to see how those leverage areas map right onto a commitment that we've really taken up over the last 2.5 years under our new executive director. New meaning he's been with us for 2.5 to 3 years, but Caesar McDowell, who's brought this notion of really needing to create the new processes and the new structures of democracy. And we call it big democracy to counter some of the trends and conversation about big data, that big data will get us there. Well, we feel like big democracy, a much more engaged, diverse public is going to get us to where we need to get to, including around our regional food system. So we're definitely feeling united with that particular emphasis. And really, at the end of the day, this is about believing, just as nature has shown us, that if we can trust people's intelligence and some of our self-organized inclinations and create these new structures, we will get to where we need to get to. Certainly there's a lot of uncertainty and anxiety and anxiousness, but it's believing that if we look around us, there is a wisdom in the wider world and in nature and in our communities that will help us get to these more beautiful forms that are going to serve more people and ensure our long-term tenure on this planet. So just boiling some of what I've said down to a few bullet points, as we've done this work over the last 4 years, and as the lead facilitator of this effort, I would just lay out maybe these 5 takeaways amongst others. But we just learned it's important to stay awake. I mean, especially if you are in a privileged position by race, gender, education, that, the psychology around privilege is fascinating. We can quickly fall prey to believing it's all about effort and not about, unearned privilege. So staying awake to privilege, to power, to disparities in an ongoing way is just critically important, as is reaching out and continuing to reach out to stakeholders, keeping communication flowing both ways, reaching out generously, experimenting as we go. There's no blueprint for what we're trying to do. We need to be open to failing, but failing forward, as they say, and to learning and to feeding those lessons robustly into the network. To expect change and evolution as we go, not being too wedded to any particular structure or process, because things will change around us and we'll need to change accordingly. And that, the network approach really encouraged us to continue not just to look at the core group of people who's meeting in the room at any given time, but thinking about the wider network out there, the periphery, that we are there to be in service of. So continuously looking to the periphery and not just at those in the room or at our own belly buttons. I'm going to skip that slide. I will say I had referenced this as a resource earlier, the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society. For folks who don't know, this resource came out recently, and there have been a few webinars on it that you might want to consult. The U.S. Farm Bill, Corporate Power and Structural Racialization in the United States Food System. And I do highlight this as part of this quote, that only when the agenda and work of the broad-based food movement narrative upholds a narrative that takes into account wealth, race, ethnicity, and gender can the struggle that low-income communities, communities of color, and women face with regard to the food system be connected to the struggles they face elsewhere. Again, just validation of this need to keep reaching out, to keep including, and really pushing for collaborative solidarity. And with that, Tom, I'll just leave, this is my contact information, email, Twitter handle, and, I blog regularly at our institutional blog if people are interested in checking that out.
Wonderful. So as I mentioned previously, we are going to go ahead and include all these links to our webpage that's based solely for Curtis's presentation. There'll be links to various websites that Curtis mentioned, as well as a playback recording of this presentation that you can share with colleagues and things like that. We do have a little bit of time at the end here for some questions, and I've been getting some good ones, and curious to hear what Curtis has to say about them, specifically about the program. Were emergency food providers like pantries, soup kitchens, and food banks, were they active in the network? And do they remain active? I guess if you wanted to expunge on that, how did you include them? Was it was it fairly easy? Did it take some effort? Kind of just some background on some of those emergency food providers.
Yes, I would say that emergency food providers have been engaged in the network. There's definitely, at state level, local level, pantries, food banks that have been engaged. I will say to this point that there are those who are interested in food security and hunger, more from an academic and an advocacy perspective, who've been more centrally engaged. I think our assessment and just experience has been that there are those, that in the food bank emergency food realm, there are some who gravitate more centrally to this because of the justice issues, and others not so much. So it hasn't been an even gravitational pull, but I would say we've left it up to the values and the vision that we've expressed to draw people in, and that has included some values-aligned emergency food organizations and initiatives.
Great. Another question that we had reached in kind of goes back to the actual the title of your presentation, which is love, power, and networks. Specifically, the love aspect of this and of your work. It seems to be embedded very much in how you approach your work. And just could you provide some specific examples of how you brought it into the work, and maybe expand a little bit on that?
Sure, that's a great question. And I will say that love is, it definitely is one of those hard things to define. And I think even at an organizational level in my organization, what it looks like in practice may vary from individual to individual. But I will say, and I know a number of my colleagues would agree, that the heart of love is really fundamental regard for somebody else's humanity, and that it means seeing somebody fully. I once met with a senior physician in Maine around some public health and nutrition issues, and was actually in a group of people and mentioned the word love, and it was this awkward silence, and I thought, boy, this conversation is going to go south quickly. And this very senior, very well-respected physician just said, "You nailed it. Love is it." He's like, I could not be an effective physician, a teacher, a mentor, if I did not help people feel like they were fundamentally seen. And so I really do operate with that, as do my colleagues, and so many people on the network team just bring that ethic. And so it means taking time to see one another. That's part of the reason that we do the storytelling. It's why we make space to be with one another. It's embedded in this central notion of hosting, which grew out of our organizational founders' connection to the Catholic worker movement. That you are a good host. You create space where people will feel fed and tended to. And so there are practices just in terms of convening and facilitation that can help with that. But I also say that love does connect fundamentally to that notion of justice. The quote that's often attributed to Cornel West, that justice is what love looks like in public. That is, just love has a backbone. It's about loving others enough to speak truth, and to speak truth to power, and speak truth about injustice. So there's that aspect as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Curtis. We've got one more question before we close things out. One individual had mentioned that they're working to mitigate the stigma of food insecurity in our school district by eliminating the vending machine mentality of pantries and moving to a student co-op market available to all. Do you have any thoughts about how to make that paradigm shift?
That's a fantastic question, and I will say that some of the local work that I'm supporting in our region has gotten quickly to that notion of stigma, especially when you're talking about people who are hungry, people living in poverty, and the notion that there often is a culture of blame and then ensuing shame. I know that part of what we're trying to do is really shift the narrative, helping people to understand, yes, certainly there is something around individual responsibility, but that sits in a much larger cultural, institutional, structural context that constantly informs who gets access to what. And so that's part of the reason that Food Solutions New England and some of these other more local efforts are looking at narrative. I love that idea of forming co-ops, of building on people's sense of agency, of young people's sense of agency, of helping follow their lead. And certainly it's been coming up in some related regional efforts around addressing hunger, that we can't sit on high and make policies for and come up with solutions for people who are hungry and living in poverty. We got to follow their lead, right? I mean, again, there's so much resilience and already there, and plenty of ideas about what should happen. So yeah, tapping into that agency and leadership.
Outstanding. I think that that's a great involving students and young people. I think that's a not necessarily an untapped resource, but I think sometimes there's a mentality of, maybe we don't need to include the young folks into that just quite yet. But if they're willing and they're, showing great promise and starting that, I think that that's a great session to tap into.
Absolutely, and I'll just jump on that and say, it's been within the last year that Food Solutions New England in particular has really hit this vein of the what we're calling emerging leaders in our region, not as if they, suddenly showed up. I mean, they've been doing amazing work on campuses, at high schools. I mean, young kids just with so much more awareness around issues of climate and injustice and how food relates to all of this, and it's we have so much to learn from them, and it's been great to deepen partnerships.
Yeah, that's great. Just I like that point. We have so much to learn from them. That's great. That's great. So I'm going to go ahead and grab back the screen here so we can close things out here. For Curtis, we'll be cognizant of everybody's time here as well. So please join me in thanking Curtis for his excellent presentation and BMO Harris Bank for their support. The presentation that Curtis shared was so valuable, and as with all of our webinars, the recording will be available for playback from our website. I would encourage all participants of this presentation to review our website at forwardci.org for more information on how Forward Community Investments might be able to help out their organization. I also wanted to talk a little bit about our next installment of the webinar series that will take place on Thursday, April 28th. We are excited to have Jordan Bingham from the Public Health of Madison and Dane County, Colleen Butler from the YWCA Madison, and Angela Russell from the CUNA Mutual Group presenting on using racial equity tools to build organizational equity. And you can register for that webinar on our website. As I had mentioned previously, we'll be sending out a message to everyone with links from Curtis's presentation, as well as a link to how you can register for this. So at this point, I just wanted to thank again Curtis for taking time out of his incredibly busy schedule to help us out and sharing his insights and some best practices and things that he's learned. And Curtis did mention that if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to him. Pay attention to his blog. He does update that quite frequently. So there's always something going on. And just thank you so much, Curtis.
Oh, my pleasure. And again, just right back at you. The next session looks great. Thank you so much for this commitment in this series.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day and happy spring.